What if the person you trusted to save you was also the one hiding the truth that could break you? In the ruthless lands of Wyoming, a fragile woman from Boston steps into a life she never imagined, bound by a marriage that feels more like a contract than love. But beneath the dust, the silence, and the scars lies a story of fear, survival, and a man whose cold exterior hides something far deeper. Stay with me, because this is not just a love story. It's a battle between trauma and redemption, where one moment can change everything.
The wind in Wyoming didn't just blow, it screamed. It tore across the wooden planks of the Cheyenne Station platform, biting through the thin wool of my Boston travel dress, and carrying with it a harsh, metallic dust that tasted like rust and isolation. As the steam engine hissed and groaned, slowly pulling away to leave me behind, I stood beside my single leather trunk. I was 22 years old, completely alone, and waiting for a man I had only ever met in ink. "I am seeking a resilient woman to share the burdens of a ranch," his advertisement had read. No illusions, no poetry, just hard work and a legal name. I hadn't replied with poetry, I had replied with desperation. "Clara Hayes." The voice was low, scraping like a boot against gravel. I turned, my freezing hands clutching my reticule, and felt the breath catch in my throat. Elias Thorn was not a man shaped by gentle things. He stood well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered and lean, dressed in a faded canvas duster that whipped around his legs in the howling wind. His face was a map of the ruthless territory he claimed to own. Skin tanned to the color of worn saddle leather, a jagged faded scar cutting through his left eyebrow, and a jawline set with grim finality. But it was his eyes that made me shiver. They were the color of slate just before a winter storm, cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of pity. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man who knew how to dig graves. "I am Clara," I managed to say, my voice sounding painfully thin against the wind. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a polite greeting or ask about my grueling 5-day journey. He simply tipped his wide-brimmed hat a fraction of an inch, stepped forward, and hoisted my heavy trunk onto his shoulder as if it were filled with feathers. "Wagons this way," was all he said. I hurried to keep up with his long strides, the dust stinging my eyes. We walked past a row of saloons and supply stores, the rough-hewn architecture of the frontier pressing in on me. But my focus wasn't on the buildings, it was on the terrifying, chaotic energy of the street. Everywhere I looked, there were beasts. Mules pulling freight, stray dogs snapping at heels and horses, dozens of them, tied to hitching posts, pulling carriages, carrying rough-looking men. My chest began to tighten. I kept my eyes pinned to the dusty heels of Elias's boots, counting my steps, reciting a prayer I hadn't believed in since I was 12 years old. "Just look at the dirt, Clara. Just look at the dirt." We reached the edge of town where his wagon was hitched to a pair of massive, restless draft horses. "Climb up," Elias instructed, dropping my trunk into the back with a heavy thud. I approached the wooden wheel, my hands trembling violently. I kept my face turned away from the animals, my breathing growing shallow. "I can do this," I lied to myself. "I crossed the country. I can climb into a wagon." Suddenly, the sharp, deafening crack of a gunshot echoed from the saloon across the street. The sound shattered the tense air. A nearby bay horse, startled by the noise, shrieked and reared up on its hind legs. Its front hooves slashed through the air, snapping its tether with a violent crack. Time stopped. The Wyoming street dissolved. The air grew thick with the smell of wet pavement and copper. I wasn't 22 anymore. I was 12. The bay horse wasn't a stranger's animal. It was the carriage beast on Beacon Street. The hooves weren't striking empty air, they were coming down, heavy and inevitable, crushing into my brother's small, fragile chest. I heard the sickening snap of bone. I saw the flash of crimson on the cobblestones. No. No, no, no. A raw, jagged sound tore from my throat. I stumbled backward, my knees giving way completely. The world tilted and spun dizzily as I hit the dirt, scraping my palms raw. My heart hammered an erratic, violent rhythm against my ribs, so fast I thought it might burst. I couldn't breathe. The air was gone. My vision tunneled, the edges turning a fuzzy, horrifying black. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, choking, gasping, dry heaving into the Wyoming dust. I was dying. I was suffocating right there in the street. Dimly, I was aware of voices, shouts from the townspeople, footsteps, but all I could see was the horse, the hooves, the blood. I curled into a tight ball, pressing my hands over my ears, screaming a soundless scream as darkness threatened to drag me under. Then a shadow fell over me. It wasn't a horse. It was Elias. He stepped directly between me and the chaos of the street, his massive frame blocking out the rearing animal, the gawking townspeople, the blinding sun. He didn't crouch down to coddle me. He didn't ask what was wrong or demand that I compose myself like the gentleman in Boston would have. With a swift, fluid motion, he stripped off his heavy canvas duster. Before I could flinch, he threw the thick coat directly over my head and shoulders. The sudden darkness was absolute. The sensory deprivation hit me like a physical weight. The sight of the horses vanished. The world was reduced to the heavy, sheltering weight of the canvas and the intense, grounding smell of tobacco, pine needles, and clean sweat that clung to the fabric. "Don't look," Elias's voice rumbled, muffled through the coat, but vibrating with a steady, unshakable authority. "Don't look at anything else. Just breathe the air in that coat." Under the dark, heavy canvas, shielded from the nightmares of the West, I squeezed my eyes shut and took my first real breath. It was a desperate, ugly bargain I had struck. I had bound myself to a cold, hard man in a ruthless land. But as I crouched in the dirt, anchored to reality by the weight of his coat, I realized something terrifyingly true. I was finally safe, and then I let the darkness pull me under, fainting completely away into the dust. Consciousness returned to me not with a gentle dawn, but with the brutal, blinding glare of Wyoming sunlight slicing through a solitary, uncurtained window. I woke with a gasp, my fingers clawing at a heavy, scratchy wool quilt that smelled intensely of cedar and wood smoke. For a fragmented, disorienting second, I thought I was back in my stifling bedroom in Boston, and the rhythmic thudding against the walls was just the city carriages rolling down the cobblestones. But the air here was too thin, too sharp, and it carried the distinct bitter tang of sagebrush. Memory rushed back, a violent flood of humiliation. The train station, the gunshot, the rearing horse, the dirt against my face, and the heavy canvas coat Elias Thorn had thrown over me as I descended into a pathetic, shrieking panic attack in the middle of the street. I sat up, my head pounding with a dull ache. I was in a small, rough-hewn cabin. The walls were made of stripped logs, chinked with hardened mud. The floor was bare earth packed as hard as stone. There were no feminine touches, no lace, no porcelain, no framed embroidery. It was a space designed strictly for survival, devoid of comfort. "You're awake." I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. Elias was sitting at a small, scarred wooden table across the single room. He had a tin cup in one hand and a piece of oiled rag in the other, methodically cleaning the parts of a disassembled revolver. He didn't look up as he spoke. He had removed his duster, wearing only a faded flannel shirt that stretched taut across his broad shoulders, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and laced with pale, intersecting scars. My voice cracked, dry as the dust outside. I cleared my throat, shame burning my cheeks. "How long was I asleep?" "Since yesterday afternoon," Elias replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "You slept through the wagon ride, the night, and half the morning. Figured your body needed it more than it needed food." I pulled the quilt tighter around my fully clothed body, acutely aware of how disheveled and broken I must look. "Mr. Thorn, I must apologize. For my display in town, I assure you, I am not usually prone to such— "Save it," he interrupted smoothly, finally looking up. Those slate-gray eyes pinned me to the mattress. There was no judgment in them, but no sympathy either. "Out here, apologies don't mend fences and they don't fill stomachs. You had a terror fit. I've seen men have them after the war. The cause doesn't matter to me. What matters is whether you can stand up and work." His bluntness was a shock to my system, so entirely different from the condescending whispers of the Boston doctors who had prescribed me rest cures and laudanum. "I can work," I said, lifting my chin, determined to salvage some shred of my dignity. I had crossed a continent to escape being a burden. I would not become one here. "I need my trunk. I need to change out of these travel clothes." Elias snapped the cylinder of the revolver back into place with a sharp click that made me flinch. "I unloaded your trunk last night. Left it in the barn. It was looking like rain, and it was too heavy to haul through the mud in the dark." The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The barn. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. Barns meant stalls. Stalls meant horses. The barn," I repeated, my voice betraying a slight tremor. "50 yards out the back door," Elias said, standing up and holstering his weapon. He grabbed his hat from a peg on the wall. "I've got fence to mend on the south ridge. Won't be back till sundown. There's bread and salted beef in the pantry. Get yourself settled. Tomorrow we ride back to the magistrate to make the marriage legal." He didn't wait for my response. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, leaving me in the deafening silence of the Wyoming prairie. I sat there for 20 minutes, paralyzed. The thought of stepping into a building designed for beasts made my stomach churn with nausea. But the travel dress I wore was stiff with dirt and sweat, a wretched reminder of my weakness. I needed my clean clothes. I needed my mother's silver-backed hairbrush. I needed to prove to Elias Thorn, and to myself, that I was not a useless, fragile doll. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I stood up, smoothed my ruined skirts, and pushed open the cabin door. The wind hit me instantly, whipping my loose hair across my face. The landscape was desolate and terrifyingly vast, a sea of dead brown grass rolling toward jagged, snow-capped peaks in the distance. And there, sitting squat and ominous in the center of the dirt yard, was the barn. It was built of weathered, silvered wood, its large double doors standing slightly ajar, like the maw of a dark, waiting beast. I forced myself to walk forward. One step, then another. The crunch of my boots on the gravel sounded too loud. "It's just a building," I told myself, digging my fingernails into my palms until the pain grounded me. He took the wagon horses with him. "It's empty. It's just a building." I reached the heavy wooden door and slipped through the gap into the dim interior. The air changed immediately. The relentless wind was cut off, replaced by a still, heavy atmosphere thick with the smell of dry hay, old leather, and the unmistakable musky scent of manure. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light piercing through the cracks in the roof. I scanned the shadows desperately. There, sitting in the center aisle, was my leather trunk. A wave of relief washed over me. I practically ran toward it, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the brass latches. I just needed to grab a clean dress and run back to the safety of the cabin. I threw open the lid. Thump! A heavy, deliberate sound came from the shadows to my left. I froze, my hands buried in the folded cotton of my dresses. The blood drained from my face. Thump! Scrape! A low, resonant snort echoed through the wooden rafters, a sound so primal and large that it vibrated against my eardrums. Slowly, agonizingly, I turned my head. Stepping out of the darkness of a deep stall was a horse. It was an old mare, a sorrel with a coat the color of dried rust and a mane matted with burrs. To an experienced rancher, Bessie was likely a harmless, tired old creature. But to me, looking up from my knees on the dirt floor, she was a towering leviathan of muscle, bone, and crushing weight. She took another step toward me, her iron-shod hoof striking the hard dirt just 3 feet from where I knelt. She tossed her massive head, the leather halter creaking, her dark, liquid eyes fixing on me. The world shattered. 17 years vanished in the blink of an eye. The smell of the barn was replaced by the smell of wet cobblestones. The dim light became the glaring sun of Beacon Street. The mare's casual shuffle became the frantic rearing violence of the carriage horse that had snapped its traces. Michael. My brother's name screamed in my mind, a phantom echo of my own voice from a lifetime ago. I saw the hoof come down. I heard the sickening crunch. I couldn't breathe. My throat constricted, cutting off all oxygen. I scrambled backward on my hands and feet like a cornered animal, kicking up dust until my spine slammed hard against the rough, splintered wood of the barn wall. The mare merely blinked, patient and still. But to my fractured mind, she was preparing to strike. My breathing deteriorated into ragged, high-pitched gasps. My chest heaved violently, seeking air that wasn't there. I pressed myself harder into the wood, wishing the wall would swallow me whole. My knuckles turned stark white as my fingers curled, digging into the dirt, trying to find an anchor in a world that was spinning out of control. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears leaking from the corners, hot and fast. I'm going to die here. It's going to crush me, Michael. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Clara. The voice cut through the roaring in my ears, sharp and commanding. I couldn't open my eyes. I was trapped in the dark of my own mind. Heavy, fast footsteps crossed the dirt floor. Then a sudden shadow fell over me, entirely blocking the ambient light of the barn. Clara, look at me! I shook my head violently side to side, sobbing, my lungs burning. Suddenly calloused, rough hands gripped my shoulders. They were large, uncompromising, and incredibly warm. They pulled me forward, away from the splintered wall. Before I could flinch, I was pressed against a solid, unyielding chest. Elias. He hadn't left. He knelt on the dirt floor right in front of me, his massive frame wedged directly between my trembling body and the old mare. He was an impenetrable wall of muscle and bone, shielding me entirely from the beast. "Open your eyes," he commanded, his voice softer now, a deep rumble vibrating against my cheek where it rested on his collarbone. I pried my eyes open, gasping for air. All I could see was the faded flannel of his shirt, the pulse beating steady and slow at the base of his throat, and the rigid line of his jaw. He smelled of sweat, leather, and gunpowder. "I can't. The horse. It's going to—" I choked out, my fingers instinctively grabbing handfuls of his shirt, clinging to him like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. "She's not going to do anything," Elias said, his hands moving from my shoulders to my waist, holding me firmly in place, keeping me grounded. "That's Bessie. She's 20 years old and mostly blind. She won't step on you." "You don't understand," I wailed, the terror refusing to loosen its icy grip on my heart. "You don't know what they do." "I know what you think they do," he replied smoothly. He didn't try to pull away from my frantic grip. Instead, his arms tightened around me, gathering me closer, enveloping my shaking frame in his imposing heat. It was the most intimate contact I had ever experienced, shocking in its intensity. He was a stranger, a hard, dangerous man of the West, yet his embrace was an absolute fortress. "Listen to my chest," Elias murmured, dropping his chin so his breath stirred the hair at the top of my head. "Listen to my heart, Clara. It's slow, because there is no danger here. Match your breathing to mine." I tried. God, I tried. I pressed my ear against the hard muscle of his chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic thud-thud of his heart. It was so calm, so entirely unaffected by the monster standing just feet away. "Breathe in," he instructed quietly. I took a jagged breath, inhaling his scent. "Breathe out." I let out a sob. We stayed like that on the dirt floor of the barn for what felt like an eternity. Elias Thorn, the man who looked like he could kill with his bare hands, knelt in the dust, holding a broken woman from Boston as she wept out 17 years of repressed, agonizing terror. He didn't shush me. He didn't tell me to be brave. He just held the pieces of me together until the storm finally began to pass. Slowly, the roaring in my ears faded. My lungs remembered how to expand. The trembling in my limbs subsided into a dull, exhausted ache. I realized with a sudden flush of profound embarrassment that my arms were wrapped tightly around his waist, my face buried in his neck. I stiffened, trying to pull away. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Elias didn't let me go immediately. He kept his hands firmly on my waist, ensuring I was steady before he created an inch of distance between us. He looked down at me, his slate eyes studying my tear-streaked face, my dilated pupils, the sheer devastation written across my features. "You can't live out here like this, Clara," he said quietly. It wasn't a threat, it was a simple, brutal fact. Horses are the lifeblood of the West. You can't walk 2 miles without crossing one. If you paralyze every time you see a mane, the prairie will eat you alive. "I know," I whispered, the shame tasting like ash. "I tried to fix it, in Boston. I tried to be rational. I can't. The fear, it's a sickness in my blood. I'll pack my trunk. I'll walk back to Cheyenne." "No." The word was sharp, stopping my retreat. Elias's hands slid from my waist to cup my face, his rough thumbs brushing away the dampness on my cheeks. The gesture was shockingly tender from a man with such violent hands. "You made a bargain with me," Elias said, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made the rest of the world vanish. "And I don't break my contracts." "I am useless to you," I cried out, frustrated by his stubbornness. "You let me decide what is useful to me," he countered, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a low, resonant vow in the quiet of the barn. He leaned in closer, his face inches from mine, ensuring I had nowhere else to look but into his eyes. "Listen to me, Clara. You don't have to look at them. Not yet." He shifted slightly, keeping his body positioned as a perfect shield between me and the mare. "Don't look at the horse. Look at me. Just keep your eyes on me." I stared into his slate-gray eyes, mesmerized by the fierce protective fire burning within them. "I'm not going to let a memory kill you," Elias whispered fiercely, his thumbs tracing my cheekbones. "I will teach you how to survive this place. I will teach you how to stand in a barn without breaking. Slowly, gently, at your pace. I promise you, Clara, as long as you don't run away." The promise hung in the air, heavier than the Wyoming wind, more solid than the timber of the barn. In the depths of his cold eyes, I saw a flicker of something desperate, a man who needed me to stay just as much as I needed a place to hide. I swallowed the lump in my throat, my hands still clutching the fabric of his shirt. "Okay," I breathed, surrendering to the embrace of the cowboy who had just sworn to conquer my demons. "I won't run." 3 days passed on the Thorn Ranch, stretching out like an eternity of dry grass and silent, oppressive sky. Elias kept his promise. He legally bound us together in front of a bored magistrate in a dusty frontier office, slipping a plain iron band onto my finger, making me Clara Thorn. But returning to the ranch, our marriage remained nothing more than a signed piece of paper. We moved around each other in the small cabin like 2 wary wolves sharing a cage. He didn't force me near the barn again. He brought my trunk to the cabin himself. He managed the morning feedings, saddled his own horse, and rode out before dawn, leaving me to the domestic chores. I scrubbed the floors until my knuckles bled, baked bread in the wood-fired stove, and mended his torn shirts, desperate to prove my worth in the only ways my broken mind would allow. But the guilt gnawed at me. I watched from the cabin window as Elias worked himself to the bone, hauling water, chopping wood, wrestling stubborn calves in the corral. He was a man doing the work of 3, and his new wife was too terrified to walk 50 yards to fetch a pitchfork. The ranch itself was a testament to a desperate struggle. It wasn't a sprawling, wealthy estate. The fences were patched with wire and sheer will. The cattle were lean, and the equipment was rusted. Elias Thorn was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, fighting a daily war against poverty and the unforgiving elements. And I was contributing nothing to his salvation. It was late afternoon on the 4th day. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie, suffocating stillness over the prairie. I was in the yard, hanging wet laundry on a line strung between 2 stunted cottonwood trees, the rough lye soap burning my raw hands. A low rumble broke the silence. The rhythmic, heavy sound of approaching hooves. I stiffened, my heart giving its familiar, treacherous flutter. I peered around the edge of a damp bedsheet. Elias was riding down the dirt track toward the house on his steady bay gelding Ranger. But he wasn't alone. He was leading another animal on a thick, braided rope, and the sight of it made the blood freeze in my veins. It wasn't a horse. It was a manifestation of pure, unadulterated violence. The animal was a massive stallion, midnight black, with a coat slick with sweat and dust. It was fighting Elias with every step, thrashing its heavy head, fighting the heavy bit in its mouth, and rearing up to strike at the air with lethal iron-shod hooves. White foam flew from its muzzle. The whites of its eyes rolled in wild, untamed fury. Even from a distance, I could see the brutal, raw whip marks crisscrossing its hindquarters, the unmistakable scars of severe abuse. Elias's muscles strained against the lead rope, his jaw locked in intense concentration as he fought to control the beast, keeping Ranger steady beneath him. The sheer physical power of the struggle was terrifying to witness. It was a clash of titans, man versus a force of nature that refused to be broken. I dropped the laundry basket. The wet clothes spilled into the dirt, but I couldn't move. Elias managed to drag the thrashing stallion toward the heavy, reinforced corral attached to the barn. He swung down from Ranger, muscles bunching as he hauled the black beast through the gate, tying the thick rope to a heavy snubbing post in the center. The stallion screamed, a high, piercing sound that sounded like tearing metal, and reared up, towering over Elias, its front hooves crashing down mere inches from Elias's chest. "Elias!" I shrieked, the fear for him overriding my paralysis. I took 2 steps forward before my legs refused to carry me closer. Elias didn't flinch. He ducked under the striking hooves, secured the knot, and slipped out of the corral, slamming the heavy wooden gate shut just as the stallion threw its massive weight against the rails. The wood groaned in protest. Elias leaned against the fence, chest heaving, wiping sweat and dirt from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked over and saw me standing frozen by the laundry line. "Stay back, Clara," he called out, his voice rough. "He's unpredictable, needs to blow off steam." I couldn't have moved forward if my life depended on it. My eyes were locked onto the nightmare trapped in the corral. The stallion paced furiously along the fence line, kicking up clouds of choking dust. As it turned toward the sun, the harsh Wyoming light hit its face, illuminating a detail that made my heart stop dead in my chest. There, in the center of the stallion's midnight black forehead, was a patch of white hair. It wasn't a perfect star. It was a jagged, asymmetrical splash of white that looked like a shattered piece of glass, bleeding down into a thin, crooked line that ended in a snip on the left side of its nose. The air vanished from my lungs. The ground beneath me seemed to liquefy. It wasn't just a horse, it was the horse, or at least the exact, identical bloodline. 17 years ago, Beacon Street. The carriage horse that had snapped its reins and trampled my 12-year-old brother into the bloody cobblestones had borne that exact, rare, jagged marking. I had stared at that white star as the beast reared above Michael. I had seen that crooked line of white hair splattered with my brother's blood. It was an image seared into the deepest, darkest trenches of my trauma. A cold, creeping numbness spread from my toes to my fingertips. The familiar panic was there, yes, but this time it was laced with something darker, something far more toxic. Hatred. A primal, suffocating hatred that tasted like bile in the back of my throat. The ghost of my past hadn't stayed in Boston. It had followed me. It had manifested in flesh, bone, and fury on this desolate ranch, brought here by the very man who had promised to protect me. "Clara?" Elias was walking toward me, his brow furrowed in concern. He noticed my rigidity, the pale, sickly color of my skin. He reached out to touch my arm. I recoiled violently, slapping his hand away as if his skin burned me. Elias froze, his slate eyes widening in surprise. "Clara, what is it? I told you he's secured. He can't reach you." "Why did you bring it here?" I whispered, my voice trembling so badly I could barely form the words. I pointed a shaking finger at the corral where the black beast was still thrashing against the wood. "Why did you bring that monster to this ranch?" Elias frowned, clearly confused by the vitriol in my voice. He looked back at the stallion, then down at me. "I bought him in town. The livery was going to sell him to the slaughterhouse. He threw a rider a month ago, broke the man's pelvis. Nobody wanted him. They beat the hell out of him trying to break him, and he just got meaner." "Then let them slaughter him!" I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat, raw and unhinged. "Shoot it, Elias. Put a bullet in its head." Elias's expression hardened instantly. The gentleman from the barn vanished, replaced by the ruthless rancher fighting for survival. "I don't waste good animals, Clara. He's a Morgan cross. He's got bone, stamina, and power. Once I break him, he'll be the best breeding stallion in the county. His foals will fetch $50 a head. That horse is the difference between keeping this ranch and starving come winter." "He is a killer," I sobbed, tears of rage and terror streaming down my face. I backed away from Elias, my chest heaving. "Look at him. He wants to kill. He will crush you just like—" I couldn't finish the sentence. The memory of Michael's broken body choked the words out of me. Elias took a step toward me, his voice dropping into that low, commanding register he had used in the barn. "He is an animal, Clara. He acts on fear and instinct. Whoever owned him before tortured him. He's fighting because he thinks I'm going to kill him." "I don't care." I pressed my hands over my ears, desperate to block out the sound of the stallion's hooves striking the dirt. "I can't be near it. I can't look at it. You promised me, Elias. You promised you would be gentle, that you would protect me." "I am protecting you," Elias roared back, his own frustration finally snapping. The sound of his anger was louder than the wind, louder than the horse. He gestured wildly around the impoverished yard. "How do you think I keep food on your plate, Clara? By being gentle. The world out here doesn't care about your nightmares. If I don't breed that stallion, the bank takes the land. Silas Vance takes the land. We end up on the street. I brought him here to save us." His words struck me like a physical blow. The reality of his burden, of the desperation that drove him, crashed over my selfish panic. He didn't know about the White Star. He didn't know about Michael. To Elias, this terrifying beast was a lifeline. To me, it was the angel of death. I stared at Elias, my chest heaving, the tears hot on my cheeks. I saw the exhaustion etched deep into the lines of his face, the desperation he tried so hard to hide behind his cold eyes. He was drowning, and I was just an anchor dragging him down. "His name," I whispered, my voice hollow, devoid of all emotion. "What is his name?" Elias let out a heavy breath, running a hand through his dark hair, the anger draining out of him, leaving only weariness. He looked toward the corral where the black horse was standing in the shadows of the fence, snorting, its wild eyes watching us. "Livery called him a menace," Elias said quietly. "I'm calling him Phantom. Phantom. A ghost." I turned away from Elias, leaving the laundry in the dirt, and walked numbly back to the cabin. I closed the heavy wooden door behind me, sliding the iron bolt into place, though I knew it wouldn't keep the nightmares out. I walked to the single window and looked out at the yard. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the prairie. The barn loomed in the darkness, and inside the corral, the black shape of the stallion moved like a restless shadow. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass. Elias had promised to teach me gently, but as I stared out at the monster bearing the mark of my brother's killer, I realized a terrifying truth. There could be no gentleness here. Wyoming demanded blood, and I was certain that before the winter was over, the Phantom would have its share. For a week, the Phantom lived up to his name. He haunted the edges of my vision, a terrifying shadow pacing the reinforced timbers of the corral. I learned to navigate the ranch yard by keeping the barn squarely out of my line of sight, walking with my shoulders hunched and my eyes fixed on the dirt. I existed in a state of suspended terror, waiting for the wood to splinter, waiting for the beast to break free. But the world did not end. The fences held. And Elias Thorn, true to his grueling routine, worked himself to the point of exhaustion to ensure they did. It was on a Tuesday, when the sky was a brilliant bruised purple with the threat of rain, that Elias finally called in his debt. I was at the stove stirring a pot of thin potato stew when the heavy cabin door creaked open. Elias stepped inside, bringing the smell of impending rain and sweet hay with him. He didn't take off his hat. He stood by the door, watching me for a long moment, his slate-gray eyes unreadable. "Take the pot off the fire, Clara," he said quietly. I froze, the wooden spoon gripped tightly in my hand. "It needs another 20 minutes to soften the roots." "It can wait. I need you to come with me." My stomach plummeted. I looked at the door, then at his impassive face. "Where?" "To the barn." The spoon clattered against the iron rim of the pot. "No, Elias, please, you have that monster out there." "Phantom is locked in the far corral. He can't even see the main aisle," Elias said, his voice brooking no argument. He stepped further into the room, closing the distance between us, until I had to tilt my head back to look at him. "I made you a promise, Clara, and you made me one. You promised you wouldn't run. It's time." I wanted to fight him. I wanted to scream, to throw the boiling stew at his boots, anything to avoid crossing that threshold. But looking up into his face, I saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the dust caked into the lines of his jaw. He was asking for my trust, the only currency we had left between us. My hands shook as I wiped them on my apron. "If it makes a sound, if it rears—" "I'm right beside you," he vowed. The walk to the barn felt like a march to the gallows. The wind tugged at my skirts, trying to pull me back to the safety of the cabin, but Elias's hand rested at the small of my back, a firm, unyielding presence guiding me forward. When we stepped into the dim, musty interior of the barn, I immediately squeezed my eyes shut, my breathing turning ragged. I waited for the panic, waited for the memory of cobblestones and blood to swallow me whole. "Keep your eyes closed," Elias murmured, his voice close to my ear. "Just breathe. Tell me what you smell." "Dust," I stammered, my chest tight. "Manure. Old wood." "What else?" "Dig deeper." I took a trembling breath. "Sweetgrass. Leather. And you. I smell you." "Good. Hold on to that." I heard the creak of a stall door opening. A low, gentle snuffling sound echoed in the quiet space. Every muscle in my body locked into rigid stone. "Open your eyes, Clara. Look at the dirt floor." I did as I was told. My vision swam, but slowly focused on the hard-packed earth and the tips of Elias's worn boots standing right beside mine. "Now slowly, look up at my chest." Only my chest. I raised my gaze to the faded flannel of his shirt. He stepped squarely in front of me, becoming my entire world. Then he reached behind him and brought something forward. It was a grooming brush, the wooden back worn smooth from years of use, the stiff bristles smelling of horse dander. He took my right hand, his large, calloused fingers wrapping completely around my trembling ones, and pressed the brush into my palm. He didn't let go. He kept his hand over mine, his heat seeping into my cold skin. "We are going to take one step to the right," Elias said softly. "You are not going to look at her head. You are not going to look at her hooves. You are only going to look at the patch of brown hair in front of us. Understand?" I nodded jerkily. Together, moving as one entity, we stepped to the right. Suddenly, a wall of rust-colored fur was right in front of me. It was Bessie, the ancient mare. She let out a contented sigh, shifting her weight slightly. I flinched violently, but Elias's chest was pressed against my back, his arm wrapped around me, holding my hand in the brush against the horse's flank. "I've got you," he whispered, his breath warm against my temple. "She's asleep on her feet, Clara. Feel her." He guided my hand. Together we moved the brush in a slow, sweeping circle over the mare's side. The friction made a soft, rhythmic shh sound. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them, but beneath the brush, the horse was a solid, unmoving mountain. She felt warm. She felt alive, and for the first time in 17 years, the proximity to a horse did not result in violence. "Again," Elias commanded gently. We made another circle, then another. With every stroke, the iron band constricting my chest loosened a fraction of an inch. I was pressed so tightly against Elias that I could feel the steady, calm rhythm of his breathing, and I found myself unconsciously matching it. The scent of him, tobacco, pine, and sweat, overpowered the smell of the barn. "You're doing it," he said, his voice dropping into a rough, intimate whisper. "You're doing it, Clara." I realized tears were streaming silently down my face. Not tears of terror, but of an overwhelming, exhausting relief. I was touching a horse, and I was not dying. Elias's hand slid from mine, moving to grip my waist, leaving me to hold the brush alone. For 3 agonizing seconds, I froze. But the mare didn't move, and Elias's strong hands on my hips anchored me to the earth. Tentatively, with a violently shaking hand, I made one more stroke of the brush all by myself. "Enough for today," Elias declared, gently pulling me back and turning me away before the panic could return. When we stepped back out into the cool, bruised afternoon light, my knees buckled. Elias caught me instantly, sweeping me up into his arms as easily as if I weighed nothing. I buried my face in his neck, sobbing quietly, completely overwhelmed by what we had just done. He carried me back to the cabin, his hold fiercely protective. In that moment, surrounded by his strength, I realized with a terrifying jolt that I was falling in love with a man whose heart was as heavily guarded as my own. 2 days later, Elias rode out early to track a stray calf, leaving me alone with the quiet cabin and the chaotic swirling of my own emotions. I needed to stay busy. I needed to scrub the floors or mend a shirt. Anything to keep my mind off the phantom warmth of Elias's chest against my back, and the terrifying realization that I wanted him to hold me again. I decided to deep clean the cabin. I stripped the bed, dragged the heavy wool rugs outside to beat the dust from them, and took a broom to the high-shadowed corners of the log walls. I wanted to make this austere place feel like a home. Our home. When I moved to sweep beneath the heavy oak bed frame, the bristles of the broom caught on something solid. I knelt on the packed earth floor, peering into the gloom. A loose floorboard had been nudged aside, revealing a small hollow carved into the dirt. Inside it sat a battered, locked tin box. Curiosity, a vice I rarely indulged, flared to life. Elias was a private man, guarding his thoughts as fiercely as his land. I knew I should push the box back and forget it. But my broom had dislodged the small brass padlock, revealing that the clasp was actually broken, merely hooked in place to look secure. With trembling fingers, I pulled the tin box into the light of the room and lifted the lid. The smell of old paper and sealing wax drifted up. Inside was a thick stack of documents tied with a faded red ribbon. I untied it, my eyes scanning the heavy legal script. They were deeds, mortgages, foreclosure notices. The name printed at the top of the threatening letters was bold and sharp. Silas Vance, Wyoming Land and Cattle Syndicate. My stomach tightened. I read through the dates, tracing a history of desperation. Elias had borrowed heavily 3 years ago after a brutal winter wiped out half his herd. Since then, Silas Vance had been tightening the noose, applying exorbitant interest rates, legally suffocating Elias to force him off the land. The most recent letter, dated a month before Elias placed his advertisement in the Boston paper, stated clearly, "Failure to satisfy the debt by the first snowfall will result in the immediate seizure of the Thorn property and all physical assets." But beneath that letter was another document, a copy of the Wyoming Territorial Homestead Statutes, with a specific paragraph heavily underlined in black ink. Section 4. Protection of the marital domicile. Under the provision of territorial law, no creditor may seize the primary residence, barn, or the surrounding 160 acres of a legally married homesteader without the explicit written consent of the legal spouse. Marriage constitutes a protected shield against immediate foreclosure of the primary living tract. The paper fluttered from my hands, drifting to the floor like a dead leaf. The air in the cabin suddenly felt freezing. I stared at the underlined words, reading them over and over until the letters blurred into meaningless shapes. Protection of the marital domicile. I wasn't a companion. I wasn't a partner meant to share the burdens of a ranch. I was a legal loophole. Elias Thorn didn't want a wife to ease his loneliness. He needed a woman, any woman, no matter how broken, no matter how useless, to put her signature on a marriage certificate. As long as I was legally bound to him, Silas Vance couldn't take the core of the ranch. I was a human shield, imported from Boston, completely unaware of the war I had just been drafted into. All the tenderness in the barn, the gentle way he had wiped my tears, the fierce way he had held me, it wasn't born of affection. It was maintenance. He was keeping his shield intact so she wouldn't run away and shatter his legal protection. A profound, hollow ache opened up in my chest. I had traded the gilded cage of Boston, where my trauma made me a burden, for the brutal expanse of Wyoming, where I was nothing more than a piece of paperwork. I had begun to fall in love with a man who looked at me and saw only a deed to his land. I sat on the cold floor, surrounded by the evidence of my own foolishness, and waited for my husband to come home. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the cabin in bloody, bruised twilight when the door finally opened. Elias stepped inside, his boots heavy with mud, his shoulders slumped with the exhaustion of a 12-hour day in the saddle. He took his hat off, running a dusty hand through his dark hair, and stopped dead. I was sitting at the table. The tin box sat in the center of the scarred wood, the foreclosure notices and the homestead statutes spread out like a fan of terrible, undeniable truths. Elias looked at the papers, then slowly raised his slate-gray eyes to mine. His expression didn't change. He didn't flinch. The mask of the hardened Westerner slid perfectly into place, cold and impenetrable. "You were going through my things," he said, his voice flat, dangerously quiet. "I was sweeping the floor," I replied, my voice shaking with a rage that surprised me. I stood up, gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles ached. "I was trying to clean the home I thought we were building. But this isn't a home, is it, Elias? It's a fortress, and I'm just a sandbag you threw against the door." He walked slowly toward the table, his eyes locked on mine. "You read the statutes." "I read that you lied to me," I shouted, the dam finally breaking. I snatched the paper with the underlined law and threw it at his chest. "You didn't want a resilient woman. You didn't want a partner. You just needed a legal spouse so Silas Vance couldn't steal your dirt. I am a loophole to you." Elias didn't raise his voice. He let the paper fall to the floor. "I never lied to you, Clara. I never lied to... My advertisement said I needed someone to share the burdens of this ranch. Keeping it out of Vance's hands is the biggest burden I have. You omitted the truth. You led me to believe you wanted a wife, a family." I stepped around the table, the betrayal burning in my throat like acid. "And the other day in the barn, holding me, comforting me, was that just to keep me docile? To make sure I wouldn't run away before the first snowfall?" A muscle ticked in Elias's jaw. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the small room. I backed up against the cold iron of the stove, but he kept coming until he was inches away, staring down at me. "Don't you ever," he growled, his voice vibrating with a sudden dark intensity, "insult what happened in that barn. Don't you dare reduce that to a business transaction." "Then what was it?" I challenged, tears of frustration prickling my eyes. He reached out, his large hands gripping my waist, pulling me away from the stove and flush against his hard body. I gasped, my hands flying up to press against his chest. "When I wrote that letter, yes, I needed a legal shield," Elias said, his voice rough, his breath fanning across my face. "Vance is a vulture. He buys up debts, waits for a bad winter, and starves men out. If I wasn't married, he could take the house, the barn, the water rights, everything. I was desperate, Clara." His grip on my waist tightened, his thumbs pressing into my sides. "But when I stood in that train station and saw you shaking in the dirt, when I held you in that barn while you cried, the contract changed. You aren't just paper to me anymore. If I just wanted a signature, I would have left you alone in this cabin. I wouldn't be spending hours trying to heal you." "Why?" I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs, torn between the logic of the documents and the searing heat of his touch. "Because I want the woman behind the fear," he murmured fiercely, his slate eyes darkening as his gaze dropped to my lips. "I want the woman who had the grit to cross a country alone. I used you to save my land, Clara. I won't deny that. But what is happening between us right now? That is real. And I will kill any man who tries to take either of you away from me." He didn't kiss me, but the promise of it, the raw, violent possessiveness in his words, left me breathless. He released me abruptly, gathered the papers and shoved them back into the tin box. "Vance won't stop," Elias said, his back to me. "But with you here, he has to fight me in court, not just with the bank. That buys me time to break the phantom, sell his foals, and pay off the debt." I stood by the stove, my mind spinning. I was a pawn, but I was a pawn protected by the most dangerous knight on the board, and heaven help me, I wanted to stay in his shadow. The fragile truce we forged that night was shattered the very next afternoon. Elias was in the far corral working with the phantom. The screams of the stallion and the sharp cracks of Elias's whip echoed across the prairie, a brutal symphony of breaking wills. I stayed in the cabin, kneading bread dough, trying to ignore the sounds of violence. Through the open window, I heard the jingle of silver harnesses and the crisp trot of a matched pair of carriage horses. I wiped my flour-covered hands on my apron and stepped to the door. A polished, black-lacquered buggy was pulling into the dusty yard, looking absurdly out of place against the backdrop of our rusted plows and weathered wood. The woman holding the reins was striking. She wore a tailored riding habit of dark green velvet that hugged her curves, her blonde hair pinned up under a stylish hat, completely unbothered by the wind. She possessed a hard, polished beauty, like a diamond cut to draw blood. She tied off the reins and stepped down gracefully, her eyes sweeping over the dilapidated cabin, the sparse yard, and finally landing on me. Her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her cold, assessing eyes. "You must be the mail-order bride," she said, her voice a smooth, cultured purr that carried the unmistakable arrogance of old money. "I am Mrs. Thorn," I replied, lifting my chin, refusing to be cowed by her finery. "And who are you?" "Ruth Vance," she announced, stepping up onto the porch without an invitation. She peered past me into the cabin, wrinkling her nose slightly at the sparse furnishings. "Silas's sister, though to Elias I used to be something entirely different." My breath caught. Vance. The name on the foreclosure papers. The architect of Elias's ruin. "Elias is busy," I said coldly, stepping into the doorway to block her entry. Ruth laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, I know. I can hear him beating that wretched black beast, typical Elias. Always trying to tame things that are better off shot." She turned her sharp gaze back to me, looking me up and down, taking in my flour-stained apron, my plain face, my nervous hands. I must say, when I heard he actually went through with the marriage, I expected more. You look like a stiff breeze would snap you in half. If you have business with my husband, Miss Vance, you can wait for him in your carriage. Ruth stepped closer, invading my space. The scent of expensive French perfume clashed sickeningly with the smell of the prairie. "You really don't know anything, do you?" she murmured, her eyes glittering with malicious delight. "You think he married you for love? Or because he was lonely?" "I know exactly why he married me," I said evenly, though my heart was beginning to race. "We are partners." "Partners?" Ruth scoffed. "Oh, honey. 3 years ago, Elias Thorn was engaged to me. He was going to marry into the Vance empire. Silas offered to clear his debts, give him 1,000 head of prime cattle, make him a king in this territory. All Elias had to do was merge this pathetic patch of dirt with our holdings and work for my brother." I stared at her, the revelation hitting me like a physical blow. Elias had been engaged to this beautiful, venomous woman? "And why didn't he?" I asked, unable to stop myself. Ruth's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. "Because he's a proud, stubborn fool. He refused to be Silas's subordinate. He said he'd rather starve on his own land than feast on ours. So I left him. I don't partner with losers, Mrs. Thorne." She reached out, her gloved finger tracing the rough wood of the doorframe. "Silas is going to take this place, you know. Your little marriage certificate might delay him, but it won't stop him. When the winter comes and there's no grass and that black horse fails him, Silas will crush Elias. And you—" Ruth leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper. "He likes his women strong, Clara. You're just a paper shield. A broken city girl terrified of her own shadow. When the snow hits and the wolves start howling, this place will break your mind. And Elias will let it happen because he only cares about the dirt under your feet." She pulled back, her perfectly painted lips twisting into a smirk. "Give Elias my regards. Tell him he should have taken the deal." Ruth turned and swept off the porch, climbing back into her luxurious buggy. I watched her drive away, the dust billowing behind her wheels, leaving me standing in the doorway with my hands trembling uncontrollably. I looked out toward the far corral. The phantom reared up, his black silhouette stark against the bruising sky, screaming his defiance as Elias cracked the whip. I was surrounded by predators, the ruthless Silas Vance, the venomous Ruth, the murderous phantom. And as I watched Elias fight the black beast, his face twisted in a snarl of desperate violence, I felt the cold, creeping dread that Ruth might be right. My husband was a man at war, and in war, shields are meant to be destroyed. Ruth Vance's venomous words echoed in the small cabin long after the dust from her carriage had settled. A paper shield. A broken city girl terrified of her own shadow. I spent the next 3 days in a silent, seething war with my own reflection. Every time I looked at my pale face and trembling hands, I saw the fragile, useless creature Ruth had mocked. I saw the loophole Elias had purchased. But beneath the humiliation, a strange, hot ember of defiance began to glow. I was not a coward. Cowards did not cross the American continent alone. Cowards did not stand in the dirt of a Wyoming barn and face the monsters of their past. Elias Thorn had used me, yes, but he had also stood between me and my terror. He had seen my weakness and had not turned away. I decided then that I would not let Ruth Vance's prophecy come true. I would not let this prairie break my mind, and I would not let Elias face his ruin alone. The opportunity to prove it came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon. Elias had ridden out to the far northern ridge to check the water lines, leaving me alone at the homestead. The heat was oppressive, pressing down on the dry earth like a heavy woolen blanket. I was outside, hanging a fresh batch of laundry, when the phantom began to scream. It wasn't his usual angry snort or the defiant whinny of a stallion fighting the whip. It was a high, jagged sound of sheer, unadulterated panic. I dropped the wet linen and turned toward the corral. The massive black horse was throwing himself against the heavy wooden rails, his hooves kicking up violent clouds of dust. He was lathered in white sweat, his eyes rolling so far back I could see nothing but the whites. He looked as though he were being burned alive. What is causing it? I stepped away from the house, my heart hammering against my ribs, and looked past the corral out toward the rolling hills of the property line. There, sitting atop the ridge about a half-mile away, were 3 men on horseback. Even from this distance, I could see the glint of the sun on their rifles. They weren't moving. They were just sitting there watching the ranch, watching the horse. Vance's men. They must have been the ones who had abused the Phantom at the livery before Elias bought him. The stallion wasn't just mean, he was terrified. He remembered the men who had beaten him, and seeing them on the ridge had triggered a massive panic attack. I stopped dead in my tracks. I was looking at a mirror. The thrashing, screaming, violent beast in the corral wasn't a monster. He was me. He was the 12-year-old girl suffocating in the street. He was the 22-year-old woman pressing her spine into the barn wall, convinced she was going to die. His violence was nothing but the desperate armor of a creature consumed by trauma. Before my mind could process the danger, my feet began to move. I walked toward the corral. The wind whipped my skirts around my ankles, but I didn't stop. With every step, the sheer size and power of the black stallion became more terrifying. He slammed his chest against the heavy wood, the timber groaning ominously. If he broke through, he could trample me in seconds. Just look at the dirt, my mind screamed. No, I told myself. Look at him. I reached the heavy iron latch of the corral gate. My hands were shaking so violently that the metal rattled against the wood. The Phantom heard the sound. He spun toward me, rearing up on his hind legs, a towering monolith of muscle and fury, his front hooves slashing the air above my head. "Don't look at them," I whispered, the words trembling on my lips. I slid the iron latch back. I pushed the heavy gate open and stepped into the dust of the corral. The stallion landed on all fours with a thunderous crash that shook the ground. He froze, his head snapping toward me, his nostrils flared, sides heaving. He was preparing to charge. I didn't run. I stood my ground, my hands open and empty at my sides, my chin lifted. I forced my breathing to slow, remembering the steady, heavy thud of Elias's heart against my back in the barn. "Look at me," I said, my voice gaining a strange, quiet strength. "Just keep your eyes on me." I took one slow step forward. The Phantom snorted, taking a jerky step backward, his ears pinned flat against his skull. "I know," I murmured, my voice a soft, continuous drone. "I know they hurt you. I know you think the world is made of teeth and whips, but I am not them. I am just a broken girl from Boston, and I know exactly what it feels like to be terrified of your own shadow." I took another step. He didn't retreat. His ears flicked forward, just a fraction. "They aren't coming down here," I continued, keeping my eyes locked on the jagged white star on his forehead. The very mark that had once haunted my nightmares. Now it just looked like a scar. "You are safe here. Elias won't let them touch you, and neither will I." I was close enough now to smell the sharp tang of his sweat, to feel the heat radiating from his massive body. One sudden movement, one kick, and I would be dead. But the overwhelming empathy in my chest had entirely swallowed my fear. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I raised my right hand. The Phantom flinched, his muscles locking tight. "I've got you," I whispered, echoing the vow Elias had made to me. I pressed my trembling palm flat against the center of his forehead, right over the jagged white star. The horse let out a long, shuddering breath. His head dropped a fraction of an inch, the rigid tension in his neck melting away. Beneath my hand, he was just a frightened, exhausted animal. I moved my fingers, gently scratching the coarse hair, my other hand coming up to rest on his massive, sweaty neck. We stood there in the center of the dusty corral, two broken things finding a fragile, impossible peace. "Clara." The voice was a hoarse, breathless rasp behind me. I didn't turn around. I kept my hand on the Phantom's neck. I heard the slow, heavy crunch of boots on the dirt, the sound of the gate closing. Elias stepped into my peripheral vision. He was covered in dust, his chest heaving as if he had run the horses all the way back from the ridge. His hat was gone, and his slate eyes were wide with absolute, unadulterated shock. He looked at my hand resting on the black stallion. He looked at the calm, lowered head of the beast that had fought him so brutally for weeks. And then he looked at my face. I met his gaze, my chin high. "They were on the ridge," I said quietly. "Vance's men. He was terrified, Elias. He wasn't being mean. He was just afraid." Elias stared at me as if I had just pulled the sun down from the sky. The hard, impenetrable mask of the cowboy shattered completely, leaving behind a man stripped bare of all his defenses. "You went in the corral," he breathed, his voice breaking. "With the Phantom." "I am not a paper shield, Elias," I told him, the tears finally rising in my eyes, blurring his face. "I am your partner, and I will not let them break what belongs to us." A ragged sound tore from Elias's throat. He closed the distance between us, grabbing my hand and pulling me away from the horse. But he didn't scold me. He didn't yell. Instead, he pulled me flush against his body, his arms wrapping around me like iron bands, lifting me completely off my feet. He buried his face in my hair, his massive body trembling violently against mine. "You could have been killed," he choked out, his mouth pressing desperately against the side of my neck. "God, Clara, my heart stopped beating when I rode over the hill and saw you in here. If he had struck you—" "He didn't," I whispered, wrapping my arms around his broad shoulders, holding him just as tightly. "I'm safe, Elias." He lowered me to the ground, but he didn't let me go. He framed my face in his rough, calloused hands, his thumbs wiping away my tears. The look in his slate-gray eyes was no longer cold. It was blazing with a fire so intense, so consuming, that it took my breath away. "You are a miracle," he swore, his voice a low, ferocious rumble. "You are the bravest goddamned thing I've ever seen." Before I could reply, he crashed his mouth down onto mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and starving. It tasted of dust and salt and a terrifying, possessive relief. For a second, the sheer force of it shocked me, but then the ember of defiance in my chest roared into a wildfire. I grabbed the lapels of his dusty shirt and pulled him closer, opening my mouth to him, kissing him back with all the pent-up, agonizing longing that had been building since the day he threw his coat over me in the dirt. Elias groaned, a deep, guttural sound, his hands sliding down my back to grip my hips, pulling me tight against the hard lines of his body. We stumbled backward out of the corral, blindly navigating the yard until my back hit the heavy timber of the cabin door. He pushed the door open, practically carrying me inside, and kicked it shut with his boot, sealing us in the dim, quiet intimacy of the room. He didn't stop kissing me as he backed me toward the iron bed. His hands were everywhere, in my hair, on my waist, pulling the pins from my dress with a frantic, desperate urgency. "Elias!" I gasped as his lips left my mouth to blaze a trail of searing heat down my throat. "Tell me to stop, and I will," he breathed heavily against my skin, his chest heaving against mine. His slate eyes were black with desire, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my knees weak. "But God help me, Clara. I don't want to stop. You are my wife. Not a signature, not a shield, mine, and I am yours." "Don't stop," I whispered, my hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him back to my lips. "Make me yours." The last remnants of our armor fell away to the cabin floor. There, amidst the encroaching shadows of the Wyoming evening, Elias Thorn showed me a different kind of survival. He was a hard man, scarred and calloused by a ruthless world, but his hands on my skin were an act of sheer reverence. He worshipped every inch of me, mapping my body with a slow, agonizingly beautiful devotion that washed away the humiliation of my past and the terror of our circumstances. When he finally claimed me, the pain was brief, swallowed instantly by a wave of profound, grounding connection. I clung to his broad shoulders, anchoring myself in the storm of his passion, moving with him, whispering his name until the world narrowed down to nothing but his heat, his breath, and the fierce, unbreakable bond we had forged in the dust. As we lay tangled in the heavy wool quilts afterward, my head resting on his chest, Elias pulled me tightly against his side, his fingers lazily stroking my bare arm. "Vance is going to pay," Elias whispered into the darkness, pressing a kiss to the crown of my head. "I'll break the phantom. I'll pay the debt. I'm going to give you the world, Clara. Just you wait." I closed my eyes, listening to the steady, comforting thud of his heart. I had touched the phantom of my nightmares, and I had found the love of my life. For the first time in 17 years, I was not afraid of tomorrow. Late August in Wyoming did not fade gracefully into autumn. It went out violently, suffocating the plains in blistering heat before violently unleashing the sky. 2 weeks had passed since the afternoon in the corral. The cabin had transformed from a sterile fortress into a home alive with quiet laughter, lingering touches, and the profound intimacy of shared silence. Elias was a changed man. The crushing weight of the foreclosure still hung over us, but the desolate look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a fierce, determined light. He had begun riding the phantom, utilizing the fragile trust I had established with the stallion to finally break the beast to the saddle. We were a team. We were going to survive. Until the sky broke. It began late in the afternoon. The air turned a sickly greenish yellow, heavy and thick as molasses. The wind died completely, leaving a suffocating stillness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Storm's coming," Elias noted, standing on the porch, his eyes scanning the bruised horizon. "A big one. I need to make sure the lower pasture gates are secured so the calves don't wash into the ravine." "Be careful," I said, handing him his heavy canvas duster. He leaned down, pressing a hard, reassuring kiss to my lips. "Lock the door, Clara. I'll be back before the worst of it hits." But the Wyoming sky had no mercy. Elias had been gone less than 20 minutes when the first crack of thunder hit. It sounded like a cannon firing directly above the cabin. The ground shook violently. Seconds later, the sky ripped open, unleashing a torrential, blinding sheet of freezing rain. Day turned into night instantly. Lightning spiderwebbed across the black clouds in vicious strobe-like flashes, illuminating the yard in stark, terrifying relief. From the direction of the corral, I heard it. A high, frantic scream. The sound of heavy hooves battering against wood, the phantom. He was out there alone. The thunder was echoing like gunfire, the lightning flashing like the explosion of rifles. To a horse already traumatized by violence, the storm was an apocalypse. I ran to the window, pressing my face against the glass. A flash of lightning lit up the yard. The phantom was rearing up, his front hooves crashing down on the top rail of the corral. The wood splintered with a sickening crack. He was going to break his legs, or worse. He was going to break out and run blindly into the storm, straight over the cliffs of the ravine. "Elias isn't here," I said aloud to the empty room. I didn't think. The instinct to protect the animal that had mirrored my own soul overrode logic. I grabbed my woolen shawl, threw open the cabin door, and plunged into the hurricane. The rain hit me like icy bullets, instantly soaking me to the bone. The wind whipped my wet skirts around my legs, trying to drag me down into the mud. "Phantom!" I screamed, but the wind snatched the words from my mouth. I slipped and stumbled through the thick, sucking mud, my eyes fixed on the dark shape thrashing in the corral. Another boom of thunder rattled my teeth. The stallion lunged against the fence again. The top rail snapped completely, the jagged wood piercing the air. I reached the gate, fumbling blindly with the iron latch. The metal was slick with rain and freezing cold. "Phantom, it's me! Stop!" I cried out, throwing my weight against the heavy gate and stumbling inside. The corral was a chaotic nightmare of mud and flying wood. The black stallion was completely unhinged. He didn't recognize me. He didn't recognize my voice over the roar of the rain. He was a creature consumed entirely by the instinct to escape the falling sky. "Hey, look at me!" I yelled, waving my shawl, stepping dangerously close to try and catch his halter. Lightning struck a dead cottonwood tree 100 yards away with an ear-splitting crack. The phantom shrieked. He spun wildly, his massive body slick with rain, and reared up to his full, terrifying height. The jagged white star on his forehead flashed like a beacon in the storm. He didn't mean to attack me. He didn't even know I was there. He was just falling back to the earth, desperate to run. But I was standing in his path. His descending shoulder caught me squarely in the chest. The impact was like being hit by a speeding train. The breath was violently expelled from my lungs. I was thrown backward through the air, completely weightless for a split second, before the back of my head slammed with sickening force against the base of the heavy wooden snubbing post. A blinding burst of white light exploded behind my eyes, followed instantly by darkness. But I didn't lose consciousness. Instead, the physical shock to my brain violently shattered a heavy iron-locked door in the deepest vaults of my mind. The rain, the mud, and the Wyoming storm vanished. I am 12 years old. It is a crisp, sunny autumn afternoon in Boston. I'm standing on the cobblestones of Beacon Street. The air smells of roasted chestnuts and horse manure. I'm wearing a new dress, and draped over my shoulders is a brilliant crimson-red silk scarf my father bought for me. It is so smooth, so light. Michael, my little brother, is standing a few yards away, laughing as he tries to feed an apple to a massive bay carriage horse tied to a lamppost. The horse has a jagged white star on its forehead. It is calm. It is chewing the apple gently. I am bored. I want Michael to play with me. I pull the red silk scarf from my shoulders. It flutters in my hands like a bright bird. "Michael, catch!" I yell. I throw the crimson silk, but the wind catches it. It doesn't go to my brother. The bright, snapping red fabric flies over Michael's head and lands directly across the eyes of the bay carriage horse. Total blindness. A sudden, terrifying red darkness for the animal. The horse panics. It shrieks in terror, shaking its head wildly to dislodge the blinding red silk. It rears up, snapping its tether with a loud crack. Michael is standing right there, frozen in fear, holding a half-eaten apple. The hooves come down. I'm standing there, my arms still outstretched from throwing the scarf. I'm watching the blood pool on the cobblestones. My mother is screaming. The crowd is rushing in. Someone grabs me, pulling me away. "The horse went mad," a gentleman yells. "The beast just went mad and trampled the boy." I say nothing. I swallow the truth like a jagged stone. I let them blame the horse. I let them shoot the horse in the street. I bury the red scarf, and I bury the memory, locking it away behind a wall of absolute paralyzing terror. I didn't hate horses. I hated myself. A sudden agonizing gasp of air tore through my throat, yanking me back to the freezing mud of the Wyoming corral. Rain was pouring into my eyes, mixing with warm blood trickling down the side of my face. My head throbbed with a pain so severe it made my vision double. "Clara! God, no! Clara!" Strong arms were hauling me out of the mud. Elias, he was soaked, his face pale with a terror I had never seen in him before. He scooped me up into his chest, clutching me so tightly it bruised my ribs, and ran blindly through the storm toward the cabin. He kicked the door open, the wind howling into the room before he slammed it shut. He laid me gently on the rug in front of the cold hearth, grabbing a towel to press against the bleeding wound on the back of my head. "Stay with me, Clara," he begged, his hands shaking violently as he wiped the mud from my face. "Talk to me. Please, sweetheart, open your eyes." I opened my eyes, looking up at the man who loved me, the man who had promised to protect me from the monsters. But the monster wasn't in the barn. The monster was me. "I did it," I choked out, my voice a ragged, horrifying sound. Elias froze, the bloody towel in his hand. "What?" "Clara, you're confused. You hit your head. Phantom didn't mean to—" "Not the Phantom!" I screamed, a raw, animalistic wail of pure agony tearing from my chest. I grabbed the front of his wet shirt, pulling myself up, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. "Michael! My brother! The horse didn't go mad, Elias. I threw the scarf. I blinded it. It was my fault. I killed him." The confession ripped out of me, 17 years of festering toxic guilt exploding into the room. I wailed, thrashing against Elias, trying to push him away. I didn't deserve his love. I didn't deserve his protection. I was a murderer who had hidden behind a fake illness, a coward who had blamed an innocent animal for the blood on her own hands. "I killed him!" I shrieked, clawing at my own face, desperate to escape my own skin. "I killed my brother! Let me go, Elias! Let me die!" "No." But inside, on the cold dirt floor, the cowboy held me tight, anchoring my shattered soul to the earth as I wept for the boy I had lost, and the 17 years of my life I had sacrificed to a lie. The Wyoming winter did not arrive with the gentle, picturesque flurry of snowflakes I remembered from my childhood in Boston. It arrived like a conquering army, ruthless and entirely devoid of mercy. By late November, the prairie had been stripped of all its color, reduced to a brutal, desolate canvas of skeletal trees and hardened, frost-choked earth. The wind howled constantly, a relentless, shrieking entity that rattled the log walls of the cabin and seeped through the mud, chinking to bite at our bones. The cold here was not merely a season. It was a predator, always waiting just outside the door. But inside the cabin, a fragile, hard-won warmth prevailed. The night of the summer storm, the night I had confessed the agonizing truth about my brother's death, had broken the last of my armor. Elias had held me while I wept for the 12-year-old girl who had carried the weight of murder on her small shoulders. And in his fierce, unwavering acceptance, I had finally found absolution. I was not a monster. I was just a woman who had made a tragic, childish mistake. With the toxic poison of guilt finally drained from my veins, the crippling terror that had ruled my life began to recede. It did not vanish entirely. My heart still raced when a horse moved too quickly, and my hands still shook when I smelled raw leather, but it no longer paralyzed me. I had begun to accompany Elias to the barn. I had learned to feed Bessie, to brush Ranger, and to stand at the fence and watch Elias ride the Phantom. The black stallion remained temperamental and fiercely protective of his independence, but he allowed me to stroke his jagged white star, remembering the quiet alliance we had forged in the dust. We were surviving. But as the temperature plummeted, the shadow of Silas Vance grew impossibly dark. The legal deadline for the debt was the first major snowfall. With our marriage certificate filed, Vance could not legally seize the house or the surrounding acreage. But Elias's cattle, the herd he had spent 3 years building through blood and sweat, were unprotected. If Vance could find a way to bankrupt the herd, Elias would have no collateral left to satisfy the bank, and the entire ranch would collapse under the weight of the debt. It happened on the second Tuesday of December. The morning sky was a solid, oppressive slab of iron gray. The air smelled sharp and metallic, burning the inside of my lungs when I stepped onto the porch to fetch firewood. There was an unnatural, suffocating stillness over the prairie, the kind of silence that precedes an explosion. Elias was pacing the length of the cabin, his brow furrowed, his slate eyes constantly darting to the window. He hadn't touched his coffee. "They're too quiet," he muttered, pulling his heavy canvas duster from its peg. "The herd should be bedding down in the southern draw, out of the wind, but I can't hear them." "The wind is shifting," I offered, wrapping my woolen shawl tighter around my shoulders. "Perhaps it's carrying the sound away." Elias shook his head, his jaw set in a grim line. "No, something is wrong. The barometric pressure is dropping like a stone. We're about to get hit with a whiteout, Clara. The worst kind of blizzard. Vance knows this is his last chance before the herd is snowed in for the season." He walked over to the corner of the room, pulling a heavy wooden crate from beneath a pile of blankets. He unlatched it, revealing an oiled Winchester repeating rifle and a leather bandolier heavy with brass cartridges. My breath caught in my throat. The sight of the weapon brought the reality of our brutal existence crashing down. "Elias, what are you doing?" "I'm going to check the ridge," he said, methodically loading the rifle, the sharp, metallic clicks echoing loudly in the tense silence of the cabin. "If Vance's men try to scatter the herd into the high country during a whiteout, the cattle will freeze to death. Or worse, they'll drive them blind right over the edge of the Blackwood Ravine. 300 head of cattle dead at the bottom of a cliff means I lose everything. You can't go out there, I protested, panic rising in my chest as the first sparse, violent flakes of snow began to fall past the window. The sky is turning black. If it's a whiteout, you won't be able to see 10 feet in front of you. You'll freeze. Elias slung the bandolier over his broad shoulder and turned to face me. The look in his eyes was one I had hoped never to see again. The cold, desperate gaze of the ruthless stranger who had met me at the train station months ago. It was the look of a man preparing to kill or be killed. If I don't go, Clara, we starve. We lose the land. We lose our home. He closed the distance between us, his large hands gripping my shoulders. Vance has been waiting for this exact weather. He's using the storm as cover because he knows the law won't ride out in a blizzard to investigate dead cattle. It's a slaughter. And he thinks I'll cower by the fire while he does it. There are too many of them, I pleaded, my fingers curling into the heavy canvas of his coat. Ruth said he has dozens of men on his payroll. Elias, please, the land isn't worth your life. My life isn't worth a damn without this land and without you to share it with. He pulled me flush against his chest, kissing me hard, a desperate, bruising claim that tasted of fear and absolute resolve. I'm taking Ranger. He's steady in the snow. I'll keep the herd away from the ravine and come straight back. A sudden, sharp crack echoed across the prairie. It was faint, muffled by the distance and the thickening snow, but unmistakable. Gunfire. Elias tore himself away from me, his face hardening into stone. He grabbed his hat, pulling it low over his eyes, and snatched the Winchester from the table. "Lock the door," he commanded, his voice a harsh, barking order that left no room for argument. "Drop the heavy iron bar across the frame. Close the wooden shutters. Keep the fire stoked. And do not open this door for anyone, Clara. Do you hear me? Not for the wind, not for a voice, not for anything but my specific knock." "Elias!" I cried out as he wrenched the heavy oak door open. The wind roared into the cabin, a physical force that nearly knocked me off my feet. The snow was no longer falling. It was driving horizontally, a blinding, chaotic curtain of white. Elias didn't look back. He plunged into the storm, a dark, solitary shadow swallowed almost instantly by the furious whiteout. I stood in the doorway for a fraction of a second, the freezing wind biting into my skin, listening to the frantic whinny of Ranger as Elias saddled him in the yard. Then the rhythmic thud of hooves pounding against the frozen earth faded rapidly into the roaring of the blizzard. My hands shook violently as I pushed the heavy door shut. I lifted the massive iron bar, dropping it into the iron brackets with a resounding final clang. I rushed to the windows, pulling the heavy wooden shutters closed, plunging the cabin into a dim, claustrophobic twilight, illuminated only by the flickering orange glow of the hearth. The siege had begun. The hours that followed were a psychological torture I could never have imagined. The wind shrieked around the corners of the log walls with a voice that sounded almost human, a high, mocking wail that tore at my nerves. The cold seeped through the floorboards, an insidious creeping numbness that the fire could not entirely combat. I paced the small length of the room until my feet ached. I prayed. I bargained with a God I hadn't spoken to since I was a child in Boston. I stared at the iron bar across the door, wishing with every fiber of my being to hear the heavy, familiar strike of Elias's knuckles against the wood. But there was only the wind. By mid-afternoon, the temperature inside the cabin had dropped drastically. I wrapped myself in every wool blanket we owned, huddling close to the fire. My mind conjured horrifying, vivid images. Elias surrounded by armed men in the blinding snow. Elias thrown from his horse, freezing in a drift. Elias bleeding out in the dark. Ruth Vance's venomous prophecy echoed mockingly in my ears. "When the snow hits and the wolves start howling, this place will break your mind." "No," I whispered fiercely to the empty room, pressing my hands over my ears. "He is coming back. He promised." Suddenly, a heavy, dull thud struck the front door. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. The blankets fell from my shoulders. I scrambled to my feet, staring at the thick oak wood. Thump, scrape. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't Elias's rhythmic rap. It sounded like something heavy and exhausted collapsing against the timber. "Elias," I called out, my voice trembling, barely audible over the roaring storm. There was no answer. Only another heavy scrape against the wood, followed by a low, agonizing sound that chilled my blood faster than the winter air. It was a horse's whinny, weak and rattling with pain. I didn't think about Vance's men. I didn't think about the danger. I threw the heavy iron bar up, wrenching it free from the brackets, and pulled the door open. The blizzard screamed, blasting a wall of snow into the cabin. Standing on the porch, his head hanging low, his chest heaving with labored, rattling breaths, was Ranger. The bay gelding was a horrifying sight. He was coated in a thick shell of ice and snow, his mane frozen into rigid spikes. But it was the color staining his right flank that made the world drop out from beneath my feet. Blood. Thick, dark, arterial blood, steaming faintly in the freezing air, dripping from a jagged bullet wound in the horse's hindquarters. And the leather saddle on his back was completely, terrifyingly empty. "Elias!" I screamed his name into the roaring void, stumbling out onto the snow-covered porch. The wind shoved the sound straight back down my throat. I grabbed Ranger's reins, my bare hands stinging against the frozen leather. "Where is he?" I sobbed, frantically searching the blinding curtain of white behind the horse. "Ranger, where is he?" The gelding simply let out a weak, exhausted snort, his knees buckling slightly. He had run for miles with a bullet in his leg, guided only by the instinct to return to the warmth of the barn. He had left his rider behind in the slaughterhouse of the blizzard. A terrifying, suffocating panic gripped me. Elias was out there. He was either wounded, dismounted, or worse. In a whiteout, a man on foot would freeze to death in less than an hour. If Vance's men didn't kill him, the Wyoming winter would. I had to find him. I looked at Ranger, but the horse was done. If I forced him back into the storm, he would collapse and die within a mile. I couldn't walk. The snow drifts were already knee-deep and rising, and I would be lost the moment I lost sight of the cabin. There was only one other horse on the property capable of carrying a rider through this hell. The Phantom. I froze, staring toward the dark, looming shape of the barn, barely visible through the driving snow. 17 years of conditioned terror slammed into my chest like a physical blow. The thought of stepping into a dark stall with a massive, volatile, half-wild stallion, let alone saddling him, let alone climbing onto his back and riding him blindly into a blizzard, was madness. It was suicide. The trauma in my blood shrieked at me to run back inside, to lock the door, to hide by the fire and wait. But as I looked at the dark blood staining Ranger's saddle, I saw Elias's face. I saw the man who had knelt in the dirt and thrown his coat over me when the world was ending. I saw the man who had pinned me to the floor and absorbed my darkest, most venomous sins without flinching. He had stood between me and my demons. I would not let him die alone in the snow. I ran back into the cabin, moving with a manic, singular focus. I dragged on Elias's spare boots, stuffing the toes with rags so my feet wouldn't slip. I threw on my heaviest wool coat, wrapping a thick scarf tightly around my head and neck, leaving only a slit for my eyes. I grabbed his heavy hunting knife and a coil of rope. I led Ranger into the barn, putting him in a stall with hay, and throwing a heavy blanket over his shivering, bleeding form. Then I turned toward the back of the barn, to the reinforced stall where the Phantom was kept. The stallion was agitated by the storm. He was pacing tight, restless circles, his massive hooves thudding heavily against the dirt floor. When I approached, he stopped, his ears pinning back, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of my fear and the metallic tang of Ranger's blood. "It's just me," I said, my voice shaking so badly I could barely form the words. I unlatched his stall door and stepped inside. He towered over me, a creature of midnight and muscle, entirely unsuited for the hands of a fragile Boston woman. I grabbed a heavy Western saddle from the rack. It weighed nearly 40 pounds. My arms screamed in protest as I dragged it toward him, my muscles burning, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The phantom snorted, sidestepping nervously as I threw the heavy saddle blanket over his back. "Don't fight me," I begged, tears mixing with the melting snow on my cheeks. "Please, I know you're scared. I am terrified. I am so terrified I can't feel my hands. But he's out there. The man who saved both of us is dying out there. We have to go get him." Miraculously, as if recognizing the sheer, desperate magnitude of my grief, the stallion stood still. He trembled, but he allowed me to heave the heavy leather saddle onto his back. My fingers were clumsy and numb as I fumbled with the cinch, pulling the heavy leather strap tight under his belly. I slipped the bit into his mouth, his teeth gnashing against the cold iron, and secured the bridle over his ears. I led him out of the stall into the main barn doors. I pushed them open, and the blizzard roared in to meet us. I looked at the stirrup. It hung too low, but I didn't have the time or the skill to adjust it. I grabbed the saddle horn with both hands, took a deep breath, and threw my left foot into the iron loop. Using every ounce of adrenaline in my body, I hauled myself upward, throwing my right leg over his broad back and dropping into the deep leather seat. I was on a horse. For the first time in my life, I was sitting astride the beast of my nightmares. The height was dizzying. The sheer, coiled power of the animal beneath my thighs was terrifying. One buck, one rear, and he could snap my neck against the barn floor. "Blackwood Ravine," I whispered, gripping the reins so tightly my knuckles turned white. I nudged his flanks with my heels. The phantom didn't walk out of the barn. He exploded into the storm. We hit the wall of the blizzard like a cannonball. The freezing wind slapped my face, the driving snow blinding me instantly. I had no sense of direction, no landmarks to guide me. The world was nothing but a chaotic, howling vortex of white and gray. But horses have a compass in their blood, and Elias had ridden the phantom toward the ridge many times. I let the stallion have his head, praying his instincts would pull us toward his master. The ride was a brutal, physical agony. The phantom possessed none of Ranger's steady, rhythmic gait. He moved with a violent, jarring power, fighting the deep snow drifts with brute force, his massive chest plunging through the powder like a ship breaking through ice. Every leap sent shockwaves up my spine. My thighs burned with the effort of staying in the saddle, my hands frozen in a death grip on the reins. "I am not going to die," I chanted in my mind, a frantic rhythmic mantra to keep the panic at bay. "I am Clara Thorn. I am not afraid." Time lost all meaning. We could have been riding for 20 minutes or 2 hours. My face was completely numb, my eyelashes frozen together. The cold was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, slowing my heartbeat, coaxing me to close my eyes and surrender to the freezing sleep. Suddenly, the phantom let out a sharp, aggressive snort. He threw his head up, fighting the bit, his ears swiveling forward. Through the shrieking wind, I heard it. The low, guttural, terrifying sound of a wolf's howl. Then another, and another. I wiped the ice from my eyes, peering into the swirling whiteout. Shadows. Gray, slinking shapes moving through the snow, keeping pace with us. The blizzard had driven the timber wolves down from the mountains, desperate and starving, and they had caught the scent of the blood from the confrontation at the ravine. Panic, cold and sharp as a knife, sliced through me. A city girl on a half-broken stallion surrounded by a pack of starving wolves in a whiteout. It was a death sentence. One of the wolves broke from the pack, a massive silver-backed alpha. It lunged out of the whiteout, its jaws snapping at the phantom's left hind leg. But the wolves had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed they were hunting a frightened prey animal. They did not know they were hunting a killer. The phantom didn't bolt. He didn't flee in terror like a normal horse. The trauma and abuse he had suffered had forged him into a creature of pure, aggressive wrath. The stallion shrieked, a demonic, terrifying sound that tore through the blizzard. He slammed on the brakes, dropping his weight into his haunches, and violently kicked out his hind legs. The iron-shod hoof caught the alpha wolf squarely in the ribs with a sickening crack, sending the predator flying backward into the snow, yelping in agony. Before the rest of the pack could react, the phantom reared up, pivoting on his back legs, and brought his front hooves down with crushing force toward a second wolf, missing it by mere inches. He was fighting them. He was an apex predator protecting his territory, and right now, I was part of it. The remaining wolves scattered, dissolving back into the swirling whiteout, deciding the meal was not worth the wrath of the black beast. I clung to the saddle horn, my heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs. I was sobbing, my tears freezing instantly on my cheeks. I leaned forward, throwing my arms around the phantom's thick, snow-caked neck, burying my face in his coarse mane. "Good boy," I wept, the words lost to the wind. "Good boy." The stallion shook his head, snorting aggressively, and plunged forward again, picking up the pace. A few minutes later, the ground beneath us began to slope upward. We were climbing the ridge. The wind here was even more vicious, scouring the snow off the hardened earth, exposing treacherous patches of slick black ice. Through the haze of the blizzard, a darker shape began to materialize. Not a wolf, a solid, jagged line cutting through the white. It was the tree line marking the edge of Blackwood Ravine. The phantom slowed to a cautious walk, his hooves crunching heavily on the frozen ground. As we drew closer to the edge, the snow thinned just enough for me to see the devastation. The snow was churned into a chaotic mess of mud and deep tracks. Dark, frozen lumps dotted the ground near the precipice, the bodies of half a dozen cattle that had been driven over the edge or shot where they stood. Vance's men had done their work, but there were no men here now. The blizzard had driven the cowards back to their warm fires. "Elias!" I screamed, my voice raw and broken, sliding down from the saddle. My legs gave out instantly, dropping me into the freezing snow. I scrambled forward on my hands and knees, ignoring the agonizing cold soaking through my skirts. "Elias!" I crawled toward the edge of the ravine, searching the churning white void. There, half buried in a snowdrift near the base of a shattered pine tree, was a smear of crimson. I dragged myself toward it, my breath hitching in my throat. I dug frantically at the snow with my bare hands, my fingernails scraping against frozen earth and coarse canvas. I found a shoulder, an arm, a broad back covered in a snow-caked duster. "Elias!" I sobbed, grabbing his heavy coat and pulling with all my non-existent strength, rolling him over onto his back. His face was a horrifying, chalky white, his lips tinged with blue. His dark hair was matted with frozen blood from a gash on his temple. But it was his midsection that made me scream. His coat was torn open. A dark, massive stain of blood was frozen solid across his abdomen, covering a ragged gunshot wound that had torn through his side. He was cold. He was so incredibly cold. "No, no, no," I babbled, pulling off my heavy mittens and pressing my bare, shaking hands against his icy cheeks. "Elias, please. Look at me. Open your eyes. I'm here. I came for you." His eyelashes fluttered. Slowly, agonizingly, his slate-gray eyes opened, dull and unfocused, staring up at the chaotic Wyoming sky. He blinked, his gaze slowly shifting until it found my face. For a second there was no recognition, only the blank, fading stare of a dying man. Then his cracked, bloody lips parted. A weak, rattling breath escaped him, forming a single, impossible word. "Clara. Elias." His name was a desperate, broken prayer torn from my freezing lips. I threw my body over his, trying to shield him from the driving snow, my bare hands frantically pressing against the massive, dark stain on his abdomen. The blood was thick and sluggish, already beginning to freeze against the canvas of his coat. "I'm here," I babbled, my teeth chattering violently. "I brought the phantom. We are going to get you up. We are going to put you on the saddle and go home. You're going to be fine. Do you hear me? You promised me, Elias." He didn't move to help me. His large, calloused hand, the hand that had held mine in the barn, the hand that had wiped my tears and mapped my skin with such reverent devotion, rose with agonizing slowness. His trembling fingers brushed against my icy cheek. "Clara," he breathed, his voice a wet, rattling wheeze. He coughed, a thin stream of bright crimson spilling from the corner of his cracked lips. "You came out here in a whiteout." "I rode him," I sobbed, leaning my forehead against his, sharing the last fragile remnants of our warmth. "I rode the Phantom, Elias. I wasn't afraid. Please, you have to get up. I can't lift you alone." I grabbed the lapels of his heavy coat, trying to haul his shoulders out of the snowdrift. He was a mountain of a man, dead weight in the freezing mud, and I was entirely devoid of strength. I pulled until my muscles screamed, but he barely shifted. Elias's hand moved from my cheek to grip my wrist. His hold was alarmingly weak, stripped of the iron strength I had come to rely on. "Stop," he whispered. "Sweetheart, stop." "No, I won't leave you here," I shrieked, panic clawing at my throat. I looked wildly back at the massive black stallion standing a few feet away. The Phantom had lowered his head against the wind, standing vigil in the storm like a guardian of death. "Come here," I yelled at the horse. "Help me." "Clara, look at me," Elias commanded. It was barely a breath, but the sheer force of his will made me obey. I looked down into his slate-gray eyes. The fierce protective fire that had always burned within them was flickering, dimming into the glassy, unfocused stare of the abyss. He was dying. The bullet had torn through something vital, and the Wyoming winter was claiming whatever heat he had left. "Vance's men," Elias gasped, his chest barely rising. "3 of them, at the bottom of the ravine. They won't touch the herd. The land is safe." "I don't care about the land," I wailed, the absolute horror of the moment crushing my chest. "I don't care about the cattle or the debt. I only want you. You promised we were going to build a life." Elias smiled. It was a tragic, broken expression, full of a devastating, profound sorrow. With excruciating effort, he brought his left hand up to his chest. His fingers fumbled clumsily with his right hand, pulling at the simple, tarnished iron band he wore on his ring finger. The metal was slick with his own blood. He slid the ring off and pressed it into my freezing palm, folding my fingers tightly around it. "You are the Thorn Ranch now," he whispered, his breaths coming shallower, spaced further apart. "The deed is yours. Don't let Silas take it. Make them bleed for it, Clara." "Elias, no, please, God, no." I pressed my face into his neck, my tears soaking his collar. I could feel the pulse beneath his skin, weak and erratic, fluttering like a dying bird. "Look at you," he murmured, his gaze drifting past my shoulder to the black stallion standing calmly in the howling blizzard. A look of immense, peaceful pride washed over his pale features. "My brave girl, you rode the monster." "For you," I choked out. "I did it for you." Elias's hand drifted up to tangle in my wet, snow-caked hair, pulling me down for one last, desperate kiss. His lips were like ice, but I poured every ounce of my shattered soul into it, trying to breathe my own life into his failing lungs. When he pulled back, his eyes were fixed on mine, clear and completely devoid of fear. "You aren't afraid anymore, Clara," he whispered, his voice fading into the howling wind. "I kept my promise. I taught you gently." His hand slipped from my hair, falling heavily into the snow. The last breath left his lungs in a long, shuddering sigh. The agonizing rattle in his chest ceased. The pulse beneath my lips went utterly terrifyingly still. The slate-gray eyes that had seen my darkest sins and loved me anyway stared up at the swirling snow, seeing nothing at all. He was gone. I didn't move. I knelt in the freezing mud, the blizzard roaring around me, clutching the bloody iron ring so tightly it cut into my palm. I sat there for what felt like hours, holding the lifeless body of the only man who had ever made me feel safe. When the first feral, animalistic scream of sheer, soul-rending agony finally tore from my throat, The phantom tossed his massive head and neighed into the storm, a haunting, mournful cry that joined my grief, echoing across the desolate, blood-stained canyons of the West. Epilogue. Spring came to Wyoming with a violent suddenness, melting the snow and turning the prairie into a sprawling ocean of vibrant emerald green. The rivers swelled, the wildflowers bloomed with a cruel, indifferent beauty, and the earth swallowed the blood of the winter without a single trace of remorse. I sat tall in the saddle, the leather creaking softly beneath me as I looked down at the muddy main street of Cheyenne. I was no longer the girl from Boston who had fainted in this very dirt. I wore a tailored riding habit of pitch black, the severe dark fabric unadorned by lace or ribbon. A wide-brimmed black Stetson shadowed my face. Resting comfortably across my thighs was Elias's oiled Winchester repeating rifle, loaded and ready. Beneath me, the phantom snorted, pawing at the muddy ground with an iron-shod hoof. The massive black stallion was a creature of terrifying power, but he obeyed my slightest command. We had survived the blizzard together. We had carried Elias's frozen body home together. We had an understanding, forged in blood and trauma. I did not fear him, and he did not fight me. I watched impassively as the heavy wooden doors of the sheriff's office swung open. 2 armed United States federal marshals stepped out onto the boardwalk. Between them, his hands securely bound in heavy iron chains, was Silas Vance. The winter had not been kind to the Vance empire. Elias's final stand at Blackwood Ravine had left 3 of Silas's hired guns dead in the snow. When the spring thaw came and the bodies were recovered, the federal marshals found the payroll ledgers in the dead men's saddlebags, directly linking the slaughter and the attempted murder to Silas Vance. The law of the territory, usually bought and paid for, could not ignore the murder of a legally married homesteader defending his own deeded land. Silas looked up, his eyes scanning the street until they landed on me. He looked haggard, his arrogance entirely stripped away by the heavy iron cuffs biting into his wrists. He glared at me, his eyes burning with a hateful, impotent fury. I didn't blink. I didn't smile. I stared back at him with eyes as cold and gray as slate. I nudged the phantom forward, the stallion stepping powerfully into the center of the street, forcing the marshals and their prisoner to stop. From the shadows of the boardwalk, Ruth Vance stepped out. She wore a lavish spring gown, but her face was gaunt, the polished, venomous beauty shattered by the impending ruin of her family's legacy. She looked up at me, taking in the black horse, the rifle, and the sheer, unyielding stone of my expression. "You think you've won?" Ruth spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You think you can run that ranch alone? You're a widow, Clara. You're nothing without him. The prairie will still break you." I looked down at her. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no vindication, no pity. No, "The prairie already broke me, Miss Vance," I said, my voice carrying clear and sharp in the crisp spring air. "And then it forged me into something you cannot kill." I raised my left hand, pulling the reins tight. On my finger, resting above my own simple wedding band, was Elias's heavy, tarnished iron ring. "The debt is paid," I told Silas, locking my dead eyes onto his. "The cattle survived. The land belongs to the Thorn family. If any of your remaining men set foot across my property line, I will not bother calling the marshals. I will bury them in the ravine myself." Silas opened his mouth to speak, but one of the marshals shoved him forward toward the waiting prison transport wagon. "Move it, Vance." I sat in silence, the phantom still as a statue beneath me, and watched them load the architect of my misery into the iron cage. I watched the wagon roll out of town, taking Silas Vance to a federal courthouse where he would hang for his crimes. It was a victory. The ranch was safe. The legacy Elias had bled for was secure. I was 23 years old, the sole owner of 3,000 acres of prime Wyoming territory, hundreds of head of cattle, and the finest breeding stallion in the state. I was respected. I was feared. I turned the phantom around, spurring him into a smooth, ground-eating canter as we left the town behind and headed back toward the desolate, beautiful, unforgiving prairie. The wind whipped against my face, carrying the scent of sage and wet earth. I did not close my eyes. I did not flinch when the stallion leaped over a fallen log. I rode with the effortless grace of a woman who had mastered the beast beneath her. I had conquered my terror. I had conquered the West. But as the log walls of the empty cabin came into view, the profound hollow silence of the land pressed down on me. I reined the Phantom to a halt at the edge of the property line, looking out at the vast rolling green hills. There was a small fenced plot of earth beneath the stunted cottonwood trees near the creek. The dirt was still fresh, dark against the spring grass. I unslung the rifle, dismounted, and walked to the grave. I knelt in the dirt, pressing my gloved hand against the rough-hewn wooden cross. Elias Thorn, husband, protector. The title of my story was a cruel, beautiful lie. She was terrified of horses, until the cowboy held her close and promised to teach her gently. He had kept his promise. He had taught me how to survive the monsters. He had given me his courage, his land, and his heart. He had made me fearless. But as I sat alone in the dirt of the Wyoming frontier, the wind howling its eternal mournful song across the plains, I knew the devastating truth. I was no longer afraid of the horses. I was no longer afraid of the snow or the wolves or the violent men of the West. I was only afraid of the endless, agonizing decades I would have to live in this beautiful, empty world without him. The cowboy was dead, and the woman he had loved had died in the blizzard with him. All that remained was the widow Thorn, the black stallion she rode, and the cold, eternal ashes of the West. And in the end, what remained wasn't just loss, but a woman reborn from pain, stronger than the land that tried to break her. This channel tells stories of the Wild West, cowboys, love, sacrifice, motherhood, and the deep compassion between people in the harshest of worlds. The lesson here is simple. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from facing the very thing that once destroyed you. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who loves emotional stories, and subscribe for more unforgettable journeys. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event.